Today's video is sponsored by Ren.
Hi friends. I hope everyone's doing super dandy today because for today's video, we're gonna be talking about all the different ways you guys can make your own clothes. For 2021, my biggest goal was to create more clothes for myself, like hand make them myself, and not just thrift them or buy them, but really hand make them. And I wanna say I was pretty successful with that. So I wanted to go over all the things I learned, all the techniques you guys can use to make your own clothes, because you don't just need a sewing machine to make your own clothes. There's other ways you guys can make it. So I wanted to go over all my secrets, my favorite tips, techniques, resources, the whole meal deal when it comes to making your own clothes, because I know a lot of you probably have a goal for 2022 to make your own clothes, and I'm here to help. Let's start with the first one, sewing your own clothes. So just before we get into, sewing, I do want to share my experience of how I got into sewing. So I started sewing when I was in high school, so grade 8 sewing class, and that's how I learned how to use a sewing machine. A lot of you might not have that opportunity to take it in high school, so learning sewing on your own is a little bit difficult. It's a little difficult, especially because I started sewing in grade 8 and then I sewed all the way through high school, and now I'm still sewing. So obviously I have a lot of experience with the sewing machine, but a lot of you don't, and that's okay. It's really okay. When you're starting sewing, I always recommend to take a class, just because it can be very, very frustrating to try to learn a sewing machine, especially when it's like getting tangled or there's something off, because if you're in a class, they can at least tell you saying, hey, there's something wrong with your sewing machine, or they can say, hey, there's something wrong with your technique of how you're using the sewing machine. If you're starting out, I always recommend trying to find a local class and learn at least the basics before you go out and get crazy. That's just a recommendation. You guys can also learn online. There's so many good resources on YouTube. I'll link some here of all my favorite channels and a whole bunch of different resources here, videos you guys can watch to learn how to sew. Back to the beginning where I talked about skill and how I recommend you take a class. If you guys don't have the resources to go take a class, because not everyone has access to that, I would try online. So either try Skillshare, there's a lot of amazing classes on there, not sponsored. YouTube obviously is another great one. There's a whole bunch of great creators that teach you guys how to sew. I also have some sewing videos. I did a 101 back a year ago on how to sew for complete beginners, where I taught you guys the basic stitches and then also how to sew a tote bag. There'll be a lot of links down below. I'm sorry, it's gonna be a lot this video. Sewing is definitely more of a pricier one. It's definitely a bigger investment when it comes to making your own clothes, because obviously you have to have a sewing machine in order to sew your own clothes. There's also other items that you do need, like you need nice fabric scissors, you probably need a cutting board, you need an ironing board. When I mean cutting board, I mean like the rotary cutter, and the board, okay. That's not that important. You also need all the notions, you need an ironing board, already mentioned, pins, seam ripper. I don't know why that sounds funny. There's just a lot of supplies you need, but once you have them, it's just a bigger investment just because you kind of need them, otherwise it might be a little difficult. So since we're talking about sustainable fashion, I wanted to bring up the topic of just being more sustainable in general, just with our lives, because unfortunately, we all emit carbon emissions. But with today's sponsor, they're actually gonna help you offset all those carbon emissions you guys are producing. So today's sponsor is Ren, and they help you guys calculate your carbon footprint with just a simple quiz. All you have to do is answer a few questions about your lifestyle, and Ren will tell you about your carbon footprint and how you guys can reduce it. Obviously, we can't make our carbon footprint 0, but there's ways you can offset it. Ren, you can offset your remaining carbon footprint with funding of diverse mix of carbon reduction projects like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. So once you sign up for your monthly contribution with Ren to offset your carbon footprint, you'll actually receive monthly updates about how your projects are going, how many trees are being planted, how the rainforest is being saved. My favorite project they're working on is the community tree planting in Kenya. They pay farmers for how much carbon is sequestered, and their farms become more productive. And they already planted over 20 million trees. If you guys want to start offsetting your carbon footprint with Ren, use my link down below in the description, and the first 100 people to use it will actually get 10 extra trees planted in their name. But as for patterns, there are tons of different ways you guys can get patterns. Obviously, the more conventional one is going to a fabric store and looking through those big books and finding a pattern you like, and then you can buy the pattern there. That is old-fashioned. That is how I used to learn how to sew things, was going and buying patterns from the store and just learning that way to make different garments. That was how I was taught.
And I know there's some of you out there who are like, Jenna, I don't really want to spend $25 for a pattern from the fabric store. I want some free patterns, and I got you. I got you, because I found this one website a while ago and I've been using it ever since. It's called moodfabrics.com, and they have tons and tons and tons and tons of free patterns you guys can get. The sizes range from 00 all the way up to 32. They have jackets, they have shackets, they have dresses, they have pretty much everything under the sun. They even have really cute tops there. They got all of the instructions on how to make it. You just print it out at home on your printer, tape it all together, and Bob's your uncle because you just got a free pattern.
And there's also great patterns on Etsy. It's usually my go-to to buy pretty much any pattern I want, just because it's an instant download. I don't have to go anywhere and try to find it. It's just online. I can print it at home. They're relatively not that expensive. That's usually my go-to. Another way you guys can get pattern is from the thrift store. And these patterns there are the ones you can get from the fabric store, but usually people buy them and then not make them and then have it in their drawer for 15 years and then finally donate it. So you can get vintage patterns there, you can get nowadays patterns at the thrift store, and a lot of the time they're brand new and they're not even used, so it's pretty much amazing. But now that we have our pattern, we got our basics to how to sew, now we need our fabric. And obviously the number one thing you think about when you need fabric, you go to the fabric store. But there's other sustainable options to get fabric. My favorite is probably what you guys are going to guess, is the thrift store. 99% of the fabric I buy is always from the thrift store. One, because it's more sustainable, we're using something that's already out there and someone else didn't use. Two, it's really cheap. It's real cheap to get fabric at the thrift store. Way cheaper than going to a fabric store or shopping online at one of those bougie online fabric stores. It's just, it's affordable. It's very affordable. And I find you always find way more unique fabric at thrift store than going to a fabric store or something like that. I just love it. If your thrift stores don't have great options for fabrics, it's okay. Go to the curtain section, go to the linen section, and look for fabric there, because you can turn a curtain into a dress. Who says you can't? Look at all the fabrics. It doesn't have to be just fabric. It can be fabric from other things that you can flip, kind of. There's also options like shopping on Etsy, where they sell a lot of vintage fabrics on there, or just a whole variety of fabrics on there where you can really search what type of fabric you want. And also another sustainable one is shopping dead stock fabric. These are fabrics that are from designers, from leftover collections, that they're not using that fabric anymore. So instead of that going into the garbage, stores take them and they resell that leftovers, so you can get it at better prices. Also, if you learn how to sew and you realize it's not really for me, I'm not really enjoying it, it's too much, it's still a great skill to have, even just having a sewing machine at your house so you guys can mend your clothes. If you guys want to alter pants, just hem them shorter. That is so easy to do. And once you have a sewing machine, you guys can alter your clothes, you guys can mend your clothes, make them last longer, just be nicer to your clothes. It's just a good skill to know. It's just a good skill to know sewing. Sewing is also the fastest way to make your own clothes. The other two options I'm going to share with you guys are definitely slower. They're slower, but they're just different. But most people that are designers, fashion designers, they sew. There's not many out there that do this other technique, but there's still some, okay? These next two are definitely not for speed racers that like to get things bam, 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 done. And I want to say my pro tip for sewing, just like, you know, a little tidbit I'm going to throw out there before we get on to the next ones, is when you're starting out, go to the thrift store and buy a big bundle of thread. just do it, just because I did that at the beginning. When I started to get into more sewing, I just started to collect all of these colors of yarn, and gosh dang, that has been a lifesaver, because every time I get fabric, I never remember to actually get matching thread. And now that I have a huge bundle of just thread sitting here, I also have more. This is just what's sitting here. This has saved my booty so many times, because I'm about to start a project, then I realize I didn't buy thread to match it. So I go through these, and eventually, usually I find a color that's pretty dang close, like, you know, pretty good. You guys get it, you get it. Next one is knitting. We've all heard of knitting, and a lot of us refer to knitting as something our grandmas do. It's something that elderly women do for some reason, and it's not true, because I knit, and a lot of people I don't know a lot of people that knit, but I see a lot of people online that are younger and knit, and it's not only for grandmas. It's for people like me too. Knitting is also really slow. Well, not really slow, but it's slower. Like, I could sew a t-shirt way quicker than I could hand knit a t-shirt. But there's also, you know, knitting machines, so there's other ways to make it faster, but I'm just talking about hand knitting, you know, with these needles. This is a balaclava I'm finishing up here, just to do a little show and tell. Wow. Look at her go. So knitting, you can obviously learn this online. This is how I learned to knit, or technically I learned how to knit when I was younger, but never was good at it. Like, I tried to knit a scarf, but then for some reason it kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so it was kind of more like a triangle. Don't know how that happened. Well, I now know how it happened, because I was losing stitches, but you know, 10-year-old me didn't know why that was happening, so she gave up. 5-year-old me, she didn't give up. She learned how to fix those stitches, and now I like knitting things. I love it. But when I was relearning how to knit, I learned it all on YouTube. That is where I found all the resources for how to do the basic stitches, how to cast on, how to just make clothes by knitting, just everything I learned off YouTube. So knitting is a lot more affordable to start, because all you really need is knitting needles and some yarn. Both of these can be found at the thrift store, so very affordable. I started off with these old gray knitting needles that I thrifted probably for like $1 or $2, and then that's how I started off, was just using someone's, unfortunately probably someone's dead grandma's knitting needles that are probably from like the 80s. I'm not really sure, but they were an old pair I started off with, just to, you know, get the feel if I even liked knitting, before I went and like splurged on needles and stuff. But the other supplies you probably need is just scissors, which everyone should already have scissors at their home. If you don't, you probably should get some scissors, because how are you living without scissors? So for yarn, I like to thrift yarn, but obviously that's not always possible for everyone if you don't have access to thrift stores. So number 1, thrift yarn, if you can. 2 is try your local yarn stores. They're just so amazing. Just go check them out. I love to get more natural fibers, because it's more sustainable than buying like acrylic and plastic one, just because they're biodegradable. They don't sit in our landfill. So that is the option I try to do for all my yarns, but again, not always possible, especially with thrifted yarn. A lot of it, we can't tell what it is, exactly the materials in that yarn, so other places, if you can get it from local craft stores, like a Michael's, Hobby Lobby. I don't know, I've never been there. I just know that's one in the United States. Walmart, you can buy yarn at Walmart. Did you know that? And if you don't have any stores like that near you, there's obviously a lot of amazing online ones, which the options, just endless. As for natural fibers, you're probably wondering what brands I like to shop from. So I like to shop from like Wool and the Gang, We Are Knitters, Loopy Mango, Malabrigo. Those are my favorite sustainable options, and they're also all ethical of how they source all their natural fibers. Other websites that carry a whole brand or whole variety of brands is Hobby and Lovecraft. Those are the usually 2 I go to, but again, I'm here in Canada, so it's gonna be different for everyone.
So for learning how to knit, I use these accounts for either entertainment, either how to do stitches, how to knit, just all around, these are my favorite.
But now for patterns. Now you know like the basics of knitting, you got your supplies and stuff. Now you're like, how do I make stuff? How do I get patterns for stuff? Because obviously you don't just go to the yarn store and pick out a pattern like you do when you're sewing. Like there are some stores that have patterns there you can just like buy. But a lot of patterns we're getting for all of these garments is from individual artists that are making them. So they're readily available online, like Etsy. Etsy is like usually my go-to for like any type of pattern just because there's so many amazing ones on there. So number one, I go to Etsy. Two, which is most likely number one for most knitters and crocheters, is Ravelry, just because they're all on there. So maybe I should switch that to number one, is Ravelry for patterns. Like again, you can go down the rabbit hole and just like get stuck down there with the amount of patterns that are on there. But really you can get anything from socks to hats to wedding dresses. Yeah, I've actually seen people knit their own wedding dresses, which is pretty cool. But other two websites that also have patterns is Lovecraft, which is another place I buy yarn, and Hobby. They both have tons of patterns. So there's endless amount of places where you guys can get patterns for knitting online. But obviously online is my biggest resource.
Psst, I also forgot to mention this. I don't know why I'm whispering, but Wool and the Gang, their website, they have a lot of really good free patterns on there. They're good. I like them.
When you're starting out, I kind of recommend this, but I also kind of don't. I don't really know. It depends on the person. If you're like me and sometimes you're kind of lazy and you just kind of want everything to show up and just be here when you're making something, kits are great. Everything's there. Like you don't have to worry about having enough, not having the right material, and just all that mental power you got to use for figuring out what yarn to use for a pattern sometimes is exhausting. So if you find a kit that you're just like, I want that, I want to make it, and you're a beginner, I would just try it out. And my pro tip for knitting, little insider for people that are new, and I had to learn this the hard way, was get circular needles rather than straight needles if you're investing. Don't get these bad boys. Get these bad boys. It's a lot easier to do this than this. You see, these are kind of a little crazy. They're huge, unless you want to get like a good workout going. Yeah, I'm personally not a big fan of them. Next, my final way to make clothes is crochet, which is obviously very similar to knitting, where it is done by hand and you use yarn. So I took up crochet this year, also learned it online just from YouTube and just learning the basic stitches, and then eventually making things on my own, just making my own patterns, just winging it. But I found crochet immensely easier for me to learn. I also had background in macrame, so I kind of like, it was just more digestible for me to learn how to crochet. So that was the first thing I did before. Crochet and knitting obviously overlap because they're pretty similar, where they both use like a hook or needles, and yarn. And you mix it together and then you make something out of it, whether it's clothes or accessory, bag, socks, whatever you want, you know, similar in the sense. Oh, we got our full overview of our 3 different ways you guys can make your own clothes. So first step, now we gotta figure out which one you wanna do. Do you wanna knit? Do you wanna crochet? Do you wanna sew? Sewing is obviously, you know, most people's preference when it comes to designing their own clothes, so that is a great one to get started. But if you don't have the money to buy a sewing machine, or you're not ready yet, maybe taking up knitting or crochet is a first good step to kind of learning of how to make garments. Now you gotta start, and this is very intimidating, and you're gonna have some failures at the beginning. It's not gonna be smooth sailing. I still don't have smooth sailing when it comes to sewing, knitting, or crochet. I always have mistakes. Don't go into it thinking that it's gonna be easy peasy lemon squeezy, because it won't be. It won't be, unfortunately. I know, it really sucks when it's not easy, right? Dang, I hate that life's hard. Best thing to do is start with something simple. Simple, simple, simple. Very simple. Like, think of a project you want to do and try to make it even more simple. Like, if you're thinking of sweater, go to a scarf. If you're thinking pants, go to a straight line on the sewing machine. But that's it. Before I go, I do want to make a little announcement that this is the last video of 2022 because it ends in a couple days, but I am going to take a little break in January. I'm gonna not post a video for a whole week, so I know this is my last video for a little bit, but I'll be back on the 9th of January with a new video. I just need a little break, need a little bit of time off, so I'll be back though. Just 1 week off. Need a little break, so I hope you guys have a great rest of your year, and I'll see you guys in the new year, I guess. Cool, I gotta eat lunch. I'm really hungry, so I'll see you guys later, okay? Bye.